You're listening to the Two Tongues Podcast. And now your hosts, Kyle and Chris.
What's up, Kyle?
Not much. I like the short intro. Big fan of the short intro.
I know you do. I know you do.
It's starting season 4 with the short intro.
Yep. So we spent like maybe a good 2.5 minutes trying to figure out whether this was season 1 of episode 1 of season 4, because I could have sworn that I recorded one for season 4, but I was mistaken.
Wrong. Yep. So here we are, season 4.
Boom.
Crazy.
What do you think about that?
It's crazy, man.
3 years of podcasting.
Yep.
Not a lot of podcasters get it for that long.
Yeah.
They give up.
Hopefully we can pick up some traction this year, a little bit more traction.
That would be great. So for those of you listening, share it with your friends, man.
Yeah, absolutely.
Feels like we should have more traction by now.
Yeah. We've been plugging away at it. I mean, you more than I have. I've been I've been not in it as much, but
yeah,
well,
it's been just a time of change for the both of us. There's lots of things going on. I'm actually hoping I'll be able to get back to a more regular cadence with the episodes in the near future. So I'll talk more about that when I can. But there was a time where I was chugging away 2 episodes a week. I mean, like clockwork.
Yep.
This past season, I went and I looked to see how many total episodes we published in season 2 versus season 3. And I want to say we averaged like 1 a week in season 3. And in season 2, it was like
an explosion.
It was way more. It was double or better.
It's the Cambrian explosion.
Yes, the Cambrian explosion of Two Tongues stuff.
Yep.
All right, man. So what I came up with like last couple of days, I was listening to one of your recommendations, which is a YouTube show called Our Subverted History.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started listening to it, I realized that it was going to make some people uncomfortable. And I'm going to be one of those people. I have been one of those people.
Yeah.
But also, the more I listen to it, the more I realize that the host, I don't know what his name is.
Asha Logos.
Yeah.
That's not his name.
Right. I noticed that he has a point about why it is that it makes me uncomfortable. There's a level of programming that's I've been exposed to since kindergarten.
It's what's interesting is that this is content that's on YouTube. Okay. So he says he's expressing ideas that are definitely going to be controversial to a lot of people, but it's on YouTube. So it can't be that controversial. He has to be very careful about what he says. And he doesn't really spend any of the time just to assess what makes you uncomfortable and what this content is that's making you uncomfortable and what you think might make other people uncomfortable. It's not like he's spending a bunch of his time talking bad about other people.
Right.
All he's doing is talking about the branches of the Proto-Indo-European tree and talking about how much he loves them and that their contributions to the world have been worthwhile and made the world a better place. That's all he's saying.
And why is that controversial? That's the thing that I don't understand. And he says it, and we'll say it, I guess, today, is that if any group of people takes pride in belonging to a group of people, it's not only fine, but encouraged among anybody who isn't white.
Mm.
And even to call white people a group as a whole, that's even something that I'm not 100%. I've never been 100%. You've heard me argue the opposite of what this guy's arguing. I say things like, to call somebody white is not disparaging, but it's so ignorant. It's like you could be quote unquote white and have like Celtic Gaelic origins and your family's from Wales. And you could be quote unquote white and your family's like Mycenaean origin from southern Greece. And you have a completely different history and path through time and culture and all that. And to call you both white is sort of, it's like whitewashing your history.
I agree. To a certain extent. I do. I mean, like the cultures of people who, that culture developed, down in Italy is going to be drastically different than the cultures that developed up in, the very north of Norway.
Right.
They're going to be very different cultures. But what's interesting, and this is something that ties into that other channel that I told you about, Survive the Jive. Yes, they are different cultures, but they have a lot of similarities, and and this is key, they have the same roots. They grow out of the same roots.
Yes. And that's been one of the most fascinating things to listen to this guy's YouTube channel. And today I'm planning on covering just the first episode, which is the introduction to this, which in a lot of ways is the most controversial, because he's trying to make the argument to why it is he thinks this is important, what the message is that he's trying to tell. And it's exactly what you just summarized, that there is a to your that seemingly history and society is continually trying to break down and erase. Like we don't have common ties, that we all emerged independently from one another. And I think trying to resurrect some pride in your deep history, your inheritance from your ancestors, like, to me, that's a very Petersonian thing to say when it comes out of my mouth. I believe that it's important to know where you came from. And I've always, as an American, have searched for my own history, because it has been erased. And it's not because of culture, society, or racial reasons. It's because we don't live there anymore. And we've been separated from our families so long, we've forgotten it.
Yeah, I think that that's a part of it. But I also think that people who come here from other cultures, they hold on to it.
Yeah.
So what the fuck's that all about? Why is it specifically us that our culture has to be destroyed and erased, and we're not allowed to be proud of it? And if we are, we're the worst people on the planet.
Right.
And that's kind of like, this first video, like you said, what's controversial about it is, like, what would the reasons for that be? Why just us? Why is there Chinatown? Why is there, Koreatown? Why is there, I mean, I don't know, just like lots of, the immigrants, the minorities are allowed to congregate and are allowed to keep their culture, and, they're allowed to move here and not learn to speak the language.
Yeah. There's all kinds of things rattling around in my head when you say that. Like, I'm thinking about how in the early, like, I'm thinking, honestly, I'm not really reflecting on history. I'm reflecting on, what was that DiCaprio movie about the New York, Gangs of New York? Yeah. That's what I'm reflecting on. Yeah. But like how in the early days of our country, certain white groups that immigrated here were discriminated against really, really poorly, really badly. The Irish and the Italians, key among them. And you had these Northern European colonists here that wouldn't even accept Southern European people as white, mm-hmm. or the Irish as white, that they called them terrible names. And
yeah, I don't know. I'm skeptical of that. I know that that's, Thaddeus Russell and people of that milieu, as the fancy people say,
yeah.
that they say that people actually believed that Irish people were, what they said, the word,
I do know
the big no word.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I don't believe that that's true. I don't believe that, people in the, the 1800s were like, they could look at an Irish person and look at an African person and be like, they're the same. That's fucking stupid.
It is stupid.
I believe what it means is that they behave similarly. And I think that that's true, that Irish people tended to be more like of the body, like they're not all of them were deep philosophers, excuse me. They, they like to drink, they like to dance, they like to sing songs, they don't want to go to work. There are stories of Irish people working on the railroad and building canals and shit, that they would set up explosives and blow the shit that they were working on up because they didn't want to work that day. And I mean, that's like maybe controversial that I'm saying that they are like black people in that way, but
well, this shit's going to get controversial today. And I guess maybe I'd hate to do this. I hate to I hate to preface this conversation
Trigger
at all.
Warning.
Yeah, I hate to do that. But what I want to say to the people listening is, I'm going to say things today like the Aryan race. I'm going to use that phrase today.
Fuck yeah,
man. And I realize there's lots of Nazi baggage that's attached to that. I, like everybody else listening here, was taught about racial hatred and the tragedies of the Holocaust and
Nazis bad,
Nazis and all that sort of thing.
Bad.
And that word, that Aryan word, is attached to that. And what I want to try to make clear is that this has a much deeper historical. This is something that was used by the Nazi propaganda machine. It's a real historical reality that doesn't have anything to do with racism, that was used by the Nazi propaganda machine for their purposes. I read a little book. It's around here somewhere years ago. It's called something in the Land of the Noble. I can't remember anymore, but it was all about the Aryan, the origins of the Aryan race. And the guy that wrote it was a white historian married to a Persian woman who was very interested in his wife's Iranian heritage, and he speaks about the deep historical roots and culture of the Aryan race. And he's referring to ancient Indo-Iranian people, not white people from Northern Europe. But there's a connection, and there's an important connection, and that's what we're going to talk about today. If we can say that people with black skin from Africa, if we can say that they're part of a group, that they belong to some sort of large family based on genetic inheritance, even though they speak different languages, they're from different parts of Africa, they've never met one another. If we can say that they belong to a group, there's absolutely no difference in saying that people from European stock who share a genetic inheritance that makes their skin look the way ours does also belong to a group. As diluted as it is through time and changes and intermixing with other people, that there's something that binds us together as a people, and that might be something that we should be proud of. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Do you have anything to add before we jump in?
I just think that, like, the name of the series, Our Subverted History, I do think that this is season 1 of episode 4, and season 1 of episode 1. I'm pretty sure one of the things that I said I wanted to talk about on this podcast is how, once I had the realization that I couldn't trust the news, it made me have the realization that I don't think I can trust history either. If you are a person who watches this podcast and you are not already thinking like this, I strongly encourage you, stop looking at history through the lens that you've been looking at it through, the lens that you've been using up until this point, because it's just totally, I don't know that this Asha Logos fella has like all of the details right. But I do believe that the general thesis that we can't trust history, that we've been being lied to the entire time, and potentially about like the most important things. I think that that's definitely something that I would like people to keep in their mind. And I think that is going to make you feel uncomfortable.
Yep.
There are going to be periods in history where you are like, okay, I have to question how I've been feeling about this my entire life. And just to like give you one of those instances, you were just talking about that book that you couldn't remember the name of, and like Nazi propaganda. I would be curious to know. I would like to go back and look at some historical examples of that National Socialist propaganda, because I wonder what kind of things they were really saying. Was it we're better than everyone and we need to, was it, let's just put it this way. Was it we're the chosen people and we're special and we need to be in charge of everyone? We need to be, the world needs to be ours. Is that what they were saying? Or were they saying we're proud of who we are and we don't want to change for you?
It's funny you say that, because I haven't, and I'm willing to bet nobody listening has seen any examples of Nazi propaganda or listened to the speeches that Hitler made. And again, I'm not throwing any support behind it. I'm just saying we assume that your first explanation, that the white supremacy explanation, is what was happening because that's what we've been told. But do you know whether that's actually the case? Could it be something more like option 2 that you just put on the table?
I think that if you look at it in the context of history, you just had World War I, and you had Germany being treated incredibly unfairly after World War I. If you don't know about it, look into it. I highly encourage you, because you don't hear about that for some reason. You don't hear about the Morgenthau plan. You don't hear about the firebombing of Dresden. You don't hear about the terrible things that were done to the German people. I don't know about any German of that people. It doesn't surprise me.
Right.
And you're a smart guy. You're not like you're not an uncurious person.
Right.
But for some reason, that stuff, you never hear about that. You have to listen. You have to be in a very specific corner of the internet to hear about that kind of stuff.
Right.
So,
and you're probably on a list if you know about that sort of thing.
Maybe you are on a list. I'm happy to be on that fucking list, though.
Boy. So your point earlier about, well, if we go back to the World War II example, to the victor go the spoils. And that means also the ability to rewrite history. And if you don't think that's been done countless times over the course of history, you're wrong. If the Allied powers would have lost the Second World War, how would the history books read? Very fucking differently.
Yeah.
Very differently. There would be, first grade school students in Germany learning about the glory of that war and the victor over the I don't know what word they would use, but the enemy that was trying to crush their national identity and trying to, squeeze every dollar out of them to rebuild the rest of the world. And it would have been a very different story.
Yep.
So, all right, go ahead.
I think that's a good point. And I just think that even with the people who win writing history, like right now, I think that we are in a very interesting time. I feel like things are like right on the verge of change. And I think that the change could go could go many different directions, but I feel like things are very volatile right now. And even without there being a war, when the spirit of the age changes, history changes. The way we look back at history changes.
Yeah.
And I feel like we are on the verge of that. We're going to look back, and these more revisionist streams of history might become a lot more mainstream. People might become more interested in them. And I hope that's the case.
You're right. We reinterpret the same set of facts to tell a different story. It's really interesting.
And yeah, I mean, you say the same set of facts, but maybe even some things that 50 years ago, 80 years ago were not facts. They were falsehoods. And now it's like, I don't know, maybe that is true, or maybe that's not true,
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's interesting.
It's amazing the amount of historical things that people just take for granted. You go to history class and they tell you this and you don't fucking look into it at all.
Right.
And that's the way it happened.
Yeah, man, that's such a fucking good point. There's a fallacy called appeal to authority. It's very common. You see it everywhere all the time. If you look into it, you'll see.
Especially when you watch debates, that people love appealing to authority.
Yes. It's like all you have to do is suggest that the scholars or the studies or the smart person or the consensus opinion is X, Y, and Z. And even if you're wrong, people are persuaded by that. And people are lazy.
Yeah.
I'm lazy. You're lazy. In certain ways, everybody's fucking lazy. And we want to be efficient. So if somebody smarter than us tells us something, we would much rather just buy it wholesale than do the fucking hard work.
I remember when I was a kid, like, late teens, early 20s, I would say things and I would think it was a completely valid argument. Well, it's like, well, people smarter than me or you think this, you know,
Yeah.
it's like, so I'm just going to accept it.
Yep.
It's crazy.
It's crazy. All right. So I approached this like I do my solo episodes. So I'm going to try to read a lot of quotes. I don't want to be unfair to Asha Logos or this channel. So I want to use his words verbatim where I can. And there's some paraphrases to save some time. And I'm curious how you feel about the way I organize this and what I chose to say and what I chose to leave out. So I'd be curious as we go along what you think.
All right. It's just to make this aware, it's been a few weeks since I've watched these, so it's not exactly going to be fresh. I didn't realize we were going to be talking about this today.
No worries. Yeah.
But I'm sure it's in there good enough to talk about.
I'm sure as we read these quotes, it's going to kick back up in your head. So I organize this into sections like I do when I do my solo podcast. And I think what I want to do is maybe I'll just read this first section from beginning to end, and then we can dig into specific sections if you want. So let me just read this. This is quotes directly from episode 1 of our Subverted History. It goes like this. Realize the subversion of our financial and political systems, our media and entertainment. When I began to see similar red flags in the teaching of history, I became a skeptic overnight. So I sought to immerse myself only in root historical sources, meaning the older the better, and the more firsthand the better. Then he asked this question: how can we know ourselves as individuals? How can we know ourselves as individuals? And he rattles off these like normal things that we might use to identify with. He says, we might identify with our possessions, our beliefs, our national identity, our politics, our culture. But then he says that none of that is deeply real, which I thought was interesting. He says, because they're not innate. They don't come from within us. They're external things. So how can external things tell us anything about who we are as individuals? It needs to be something from within. And so I asked the question, so what is innate? And then listen to this quote. He says, the blood that flows through our veins has lived before, countless times before. Man. He says, an understanding of our roots helps inform us of who we are and how to best be and grow. This is the power of history. He says, one can't properly orient and direct their future unless they understand their past, the collective experiences of their ancestors. And lastly, he says, my purpose, and this is important, listen to this, my purpose is not to proclaim the greatness of Indo-European peoples or illustrate their history of achievement. And it's certainly not to put down other groups. The goal here is to attempt to piece together an accurate and honest portrait of history in an age when information is completely subverting and rewriting the record. Because this truth matters, and it's difficult to imagine a greater crime than the wholesale rewriting of history. What do you got? What do you got on that? Anything pop in your head?
That last part specifically makes me wonder why it is, and I mean, I've talked about this earlier already, why it is encouraged for, people of African descent, people of Asian descent, people of Latino descent, why it's encouraged for them to be proud of their roots. But not only is it like, I don't know, man, it's like the worst thing in the world if we do it.
You're right. The moment a white person says something that indicates they're proud of being white or belonging to a group of Europeans, I even have this reaction that I'm like holding in right now that makes me pull away from it. It's like society has taught me that I should not think that and I should not say that. It's some weird programming that I referred to earlier. But if I were black and I said that, people would be clapping.
Oh yeah.
Because in their mind, their history was robbed from them. And so having pride in their history is some sort of a regaining of something lost. And when we say it, it's like, it's racist, man. I don't know. I don't understand it.
And so that's obviously the truth. That what we're just talking about there is obviously a true statement. I don't think anybody I mean, I'm sure that some shit lib type people would try to say, oh, it's just in your head. It's fine. You know, it's not bad to, you know, actually, I don't know if anybody would say the phrase, it's not bad to be white, but they would still try to, you know, I hate when people use this word, but they would try to gaslight you and be like, you're crazy. You know, it's not, you're imagining this, you're just paranoid. But to anybody who is not lying to themselves, what we just said is obviously true. So my question, I think the really interesting thing is like, why is that happening? Who is encouraging that? Where is that coming from? And what is their motivation? And I think that what he says here, I can't find it here. Something about orienting yourself, you know, in your future.
Yep. Right.
Yeah. One can't properly orient and direct their future unless they understand their past. And it's like, what? Due to all of this, like cultural retardation and cultural degradation that we have experienced, we don't. It's like yeah, like we're not a unit, is what I'm trying to say. Like we're very like balkanized.
Disjointed,
we're all over, yeah, you know, a lot of, you know, white people disagree with each other on a lot of things. And I'm not saying that that wasn't the case back in Proto-Indo-Europe, but I bet you it was a lot fucking less.
Right.
I bet you that these members of tribes, sure, they had disagreements, but I'm pretty sure that it was not as drastic as it is with, you know, me and a bunch of other whiteys out there, you know?
Yeah. You mean that disparate groups might have thought of themselves as more closely kindred than they do today? Yeah. Just on the surface level?
And that what was good for these people was largely good for these people who were very much like them. You know, even if they lived like hundreds of miles away, that like generally, if they lived in societies that were organized this way, it's good for them. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Whereas when you start, you know, changing that drastically, it becomes not as good for them. And like, look, you know, just look at how things are going. You know, white people are not exactly doing great right now. You know, I think, you know, it's like how many people are dying all the time with the fentanyl, and people are in debt up to their eyeballs. You know,
and white people as a group are being attacked culturally and socially and genetically every which way. And it's
physically,
and physically, yeah. It's things like affirmative action, which I can see people arguing exactly the opposite of this, but yeah, it's designed to help marginalized groups. But okay, it does that, but it's also harming. You know, this is the merit equity argument. Basically, it's potentially harming another group of people. So it's racist. It's just as racist. It's just, you know, pointed in a different direction. And
so, like I was saying, they had to split us all up and get us arguing about a bunch of things that are not really important to our lives, you know? And the reason that it's, you know, again, one can't properly orient and direct their future. So what kind of future, if we were all on the same page, largely, you know, about minutia, there are arguments, but if we were largely all moving in the same direction and in agreement, what kind of future would we be orienting ourselves towards and directing ourselves towards that whoever is encouraging this is so worried about?
It's an interesting question, and my lack of imagination here is, you know, is terrible. I don't fucking know.
I wonder if the future that they're worried about us directing ourselves toward is a future that looks a lot more like the past, you know, not the past of 10 years ago, not the past of 20 years ago, but the past of, you know, a few thousand years ago. I mean, I'm not talking about getting rid of technology or anything like that, but I'm talking about the ways in which we deal with each other, the way in which we deal with other people, the things that we see as important. You know, I'm wondering if that's what they don't want us to go back to.
That's interesting because Asha Logos does talk about the divide and conquer nonsense. He uses that phrase. And what you're describing is a world divided arbitrarily and fighting so that they aren't able to stand in unity, strongly in unity, and push back against whatever power has been doing the manipulation. And if that's the case, we're just much easier to manipulate. And I realize that might be like a globalist conspiracy theory sort of angle, but it makes sense. It makes sense that might be the goal of it. I mean, we're in an election year right now, and that's when these sort of tactics ramp up. And right now, I'm particularly sensitive to the divide and conquer and how well it works. And we're seeing it. We're seeing it right now.
Yeah, I do like to think that maybe it's starting to work less well, though.
I hope so.
Yeah, maybe it's just me trying to be optimistic, but
wishful thinking.
Yeah.
So I want to tell you a couple things about this that stood out to me. You might have noticed the way I responded or the way I reacted to this quote. The blood that flows through your veins has lived before countless times before. God damn, there's something so mystical and Jungian about that. It just makes the hair stand up on my arms. It's like when people talk about their genetic inheritance and their DNA, that's your blood. And we have all these euphemisms like, blood's thicker than water, and, your kin is your blood, and all these things that we say in the culture that means something still, but maybe not as much as it once did. But he's describing what that means is like the code in my DNA can be traced back to the beginning of life. Mm-hmm. And that unique path that my ancestors took to get to me, which is completely unique to me and different from everyone else, although follows a similar trajectory in our family groups and our kin groups, that is blood that has lived before. My father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, these were individual human beings with personalities and desires and goals and accomplishments and all of these things of their own. That is an inheritance somehow that belongs to me. It doesn't just belong to me, it flows through my veins. And to say that you can't be proud of that, that it's racist to be proud of that, I mean, I can't imagine a more ridiculous thing to say.
Not only does it flow through your veins, it informs everything about you. I mean, the blood is like, blood is, historically like a very symbolic thing, But I think if you think about it in like a modern scientific context, I don't always I think a lot of times modern scientific way of thinking just robs things of their mysticism. But if you think about genetics, genetics is like a mystical, I mean, it's like you're talking about with the blood, like everything about you, like I said, the blood is a very like one thing, like a very simple, but the genetics, man,
I mean,
it makes up everything that you are.
100%. It's like just while we're talking from like a racial perspective, just the fact that we have pale skin, we all know the scientific reason for that, right? It's like when our ancestors moved to the north,
proximity to the equator,
and we needed more vitamin D in our bodies, and our dark colored skin wasn't allowing us to absorb it. At some point, one of our ancestors had a mutation that was advantageous, that spread across the entire population group. So what we're saying is that we're inheriting the benefit of an unnumbered amount of people suffering to get to that change that was beneficial that we inherit. And so I'm born with this advantage that comes from my ancestors. I have this inheritance, and that's just one example. What other examples? What other suffering and torment and challenges that actual living, breathing human beings had to conquer to be able to continue, to be able to have life continue so that I might exist in the future? And we inherit all of that, Mm-hmm. Another thing about this that I liked was the question that he asks when he says, how can we know ourselves as individuals? And you can see what I put there. It reminds me of the Temple of Delphi. I talk about this a lot, but the Temple of Delphi in ancient Greece, where people would go to speak to the priestess, and in the temple was carved, "Know thyself." That was the dictum. When you went to see the priestess, you were intended to meditate on this. Know thyself. And when he asked that question, how can we know ourselves as individuals? I just feel like he's asking this perennial question. Know thyself.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Anything else before we move on?
No.
I
don't think so.
All right. And again, just to reiterate this last quote that I read where he's talking about, look, I'm doing this not to proclaim the greatness of white people, although he says Indo-European people, or to illustrate, all the achievements and contributions that we made to the world or whatever. And he's certainly not doing it to put down other groups. He wants to set the record straight from a historical perspective. And I want to say, before we carry on too far, that there's two elements going on with Asha Logos in this series. The first one is a pushback, clearly a pushback against political correctness and the revisionist history that are just political and social tools of manipulation. He's pushing back against that. I think in this day and age, most people can see it very clearly and easily. And that's what he opened with when he said, most of us realize the subversion of our financial and political systems, our media and entertainment. This is what he means. Pushing back against. But he also has this Graham Hancock kind of a thing going on. And he says at the end of the first episode that this is one person that was a big influence on him. And he means alternative history.
Yeah. The
ability to look open-mindedly at information and to allow yourself to consider other possibilities that the mainstream historians, archaeologists are saying. Is there another possible explanation?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of this. And when we start getting into the specifics of his argument, I want you to understand that some of it may seem like a stretch. The same way when you read Graham Hancock, you think, okay, some of this is really intriguing and some of it might be a stretch. I don't know how you feel about it, and I can point it out where I think it might be a stretch, but it's honest ways of looking at alternative interpretations of history, and some of it is more believable than others. That's all I want to say.
Like I said, I don't necessarily know that he has all of the details right, but I will say that I'm at a point in my life where I've made a conscious effort to get rid of all of the, I think you'd be surprised the amount of things that I could entertain as possibly true. You know what I mean? Yeah. So many things are built on such a weak foundation that it's I just have to get rid of all of this stuff, so much of history, and not just this kind of human history. I'm talking about the origins of the world. I have no idea. These scientific models, I don't believe them at all. Maybe they're true, but I don't really, I'm kind of skeptical of it, to be honest with you.
Well, there's such thing as healthy skepticism. I think that's fair.
Yeah. And again, you go to history class and you just accept everything. People accept these scientific notions, just oh, this has got to be true. Big Bang. That's it.
Yep.
No way it happened any other way.
Yeah. Or if there's any other interpretation of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I don't really remember where I was going with that.
Okay. Well, that brings me to the next section, which I'm going to call the argument.
All right.
All right. So I can read some of this. We can stop and go as you want to, but the argument. So it goes like this. We no longer allow positive things to be said about those of Indo-European background as a group. And simultaneously, we not only allow but encourage negative things. The opposite is true of every other group. So that's what we just said. He said, we're told we're all blank slates and fresh starts, entirely formed by our environment.
That's that's one of those things that in the past few years, I've just completely let go of. The tabula rasa idea that we're all blank slates. I do not believe it.
Yep. Yeah. So that's interesting because I think it's tied to the IQ testing controversy, racial differences in IQ testing and things like that. It's if we're all born blank slates, then the only possible variable is the environment. So if certain groups of people don't develop as high IQ as others, that must mean we need to pour a bunch of money into the social economic conditions of their society, because there's nothing innate in them that is causing that difference. It must be external. This is just one controversial application of this idea. If we're all blank slates, then we're all equal with equal capacity as babies and can become just as successful as anybody else. There's no reason that our outcomes should be different. This is tied to the whole equity push that we're seeing today.
And it's tied to that, but it's also like, and this isn't one of those things that might make people uncomfortable. It's like one of those presuppositions that you have that you should question, and it's going to make you uncomfortable. That tabula rasa, blank slate idea is one of the foundational things that like the Enlightenment and the West were built on. Those are foundational ideas to our modern Western culture, and they're wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And this whole thing, and when Kyle says they're wrong, and I say absolutely, just nodding my head, the reason I say that is because for scientific reasons. So when he says that we're all blank slates and fresh starts formed entirely by our environment, like this is what we're told and taught, that ignores epigenetics entirely. It ignores the idea that we can pass things on to our kids. It ignores inheritance entirely. It erases your history.
It ignores the science that they value so much directly. I mean, I know that's what you're saying, but like they've done tons of things like twin studies, like twins separated at birth.
Yeah.
One of them goes to this kind of an environment. One of them goes to this, and they end up very similar regardless of the environment.
Right.
It's interesting stuff. And like that kind of stuff, people, if there was a scientific study that proved the opposite of that, people would love it. You know, they would quote it all the time.
Right.
But there's this study that exists, and they won't touch it with a, what is it, 39.5-foot pole?
Yeah. Well, let me make everybody uncomfortable for a second. Just notice how uncomfortable this makes you. What would it mean if we're not all blank slates? What would it mean?
It means that we're different.
What would it mean if some people are born with different capabilities and potentials than other people? The moment you say that, people will suggest that makes some people better than others. And in some cases, and it depends on what the measuring stick is, right? Yeah. It's okay for some people to be better than others. Everybody you know in your life is better than you at something.
I don't quote Michael Malice very much anymore, but he's got good lines on occasion. And one of the earliest ones that I remember from him is, how do you find out if someone is right as a right wing or left wing? It's you ask them, are some people better than others? And a right wing person says, yes, some people are better than others.
Yeah.
And a left wing person gives you a speech.
That's interesting. And that makes, there's some people listening that are uncomfortable with that. Are some people better than others? And your mind might go like I said, the measuring stick can be different. Are some people morally better? I'm not talking about groups of people. Individuals. Are some individuals better than others? Are some better at basketball? Are some better at weightlifting? Are some better at making love to a woman? Are some better at mathematics, right? Yes, of course. Everybody you've ever met has got different capabilities and aptitudes. And is it possible that some of those things cluster by kinship group? Is it possible that me, like my cousins, have similar IQ? Of fucking course it can.
Yep. What's funny is that a lot of people, I would say the vast majority of people, when it comes down to like an individual basis, of course that's true. Like that guy's smarter than that guy. Like nobody, I don't know. And I think that even inherently people know that like, no, this guy, no matter what kind of schooling this guy got, he's not going to be as smart as this guy. It's just like, I work with people and they're related. I don't want to get too specific about people that I work with, but I work with two people and they're very closely related. And they are actually very different. But again, I don't, there's reasons for that. I just don't want to be too specific about real life people. But I mean, how do I get this across without sounding completely terrible? So I work with people. I'm not saying names or anything. I'm not saying where I work. They're father and son, okay? And the son is way sharper and more competent at like pretty much everything he does than the father is. And you know what? I'm just gonna put this whole thing out there because so they're Puerto Rican, okay? And they've said explicitly to me that they don't particularly like white people. They made it seem like, you're okay.
You're one of the good ones.
Yeah. But the son, his mom is white, and he's like, that's the tainted side of me. I have a strong suspicion that tainted side of you is the reason you pick things up so much quicker, because I work with you both, like I can see the competency, the difference in competency. Right. Now
that's making lots of people uncomfortable. And I realize why you're hesitant to say it. But if you're looking at inheritance if you're comparing strictly on that basis, what could make that the difference between those two very closely related people? Well, that's the elephant in the room, isn't it? And that doesn't mean, see, this is the thing.
Big white elephant in the
room. We're going to get to this at the end, and I want to talk about this in a little bit more detail, but it's not about better or worse comprehensively. We all know this. If somebody, as a stereotype, Asian people, specifically East Asian people, really good at math and science, right? That's something that's a stereotype. Where am I going with this? I lost my thread.
Happens to the best of them, man.
But I guess the point is, I don't know what the point is.
I think another thing that's interesting is that a lot of these people who are very uncomfortable right now, when it comes to specific groups, again, they make exceptions for the other groups. It's us that's not allowed to feel this way. But if you ask a person, hey, what kind of group of people has, generally really high IQs? There's like Asians and Jews, and it's okay for them those groups to have those
Ashkenazi Jews specifically. Right? Yeah. But I guess the point I was trying to make is when I was saying comprehensive, it's like somebody could have something that they're particularly adept at. And it could be something that is, like I suggested earlier, genetically inherited, or the capacity or potential genetically inherited. And you can see it across, small family groups. You can see it across larger ethnic groups, let's say. And that's where stereotypes come from. But that's not going to make the Asian guy good at basketball. It's not going to make him athletic in that way. Mm-hmm. And we could point to a different group of people who I'll avoid specifically addressing that has that particular capability, very tall, very athletic, fast twitch, muscle fiber, all these things that lends to a particular aptitude. We're not talking about something comprehensively being better or worse. A group being comprehensively better or worse, that's nonsense. It means nothing. We're all multifaceted and complex, and we all have different strengths and weaknesses. Mm-hmm. Should be nothing controversial about that.
I agree. And I mean, I also don't think that it's like particularly bad for a person who is a part of one group to say, I'm glad I'm a part of this group. Because they've been raised in those traditions, and that's what's comfortable to them. And the idea of going and doing things a completely alien way, it's like, no, I don't want to do that. I don't think that's bad. That's fine. I completely understand.
And the idea that those characteristics in a particular group exist today, that means they carried on from the past all the way to the present, means that they're valuable enough that evolution has selected them for survival. And we see lots of different people still surviving for lots of different reasons. Why should anybody not be proud of that inheritance? Something that nature values enough to continue to perpetuate into the future. If nature values it, who the fuck are you to say otherwise?
Yeah, if that's the way you think about things.
I could say, I could say nature, or I could say nature with a capital N, and then it's wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I'm talking about God, right? But whatever.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So he's pushing back against this idea that we're all blank slates and fresh starts. He says this: if we start with the premise that there are no differences between peoples, any historical record that seems to highlight differences must be misinformed or a product of racism. One follows from the other, right? If everyone's a blank slate and you notice differences, you're either wrong or racist. That's the narrative. He says, if you'd like to be fired, ally yourself with practically every major thinker prior to 1945.
I love that he the line right before that. It's amazing that this is stuck in my head, but it's because it's a good line, and he's taking a dig at Jared Diamond, the guns, germs, and steel guy. He's like, if you want, I don't know, I forget specifically, but it's like, if you want people to pat you on the back, align yourself with the offensively stupid ideas of Jared Diamond or something like that. You know?
The only reason I didn't include that is because I never read the book, so I don't really know what he says in it.
I've not read the book either, but I've listened to people talk about it.
And then he says this. He asks the question, which is more likely? All great pre-World War II thinkers from nations all across the world were vicious racists driven by hatred, or that our current politically correct atmosphere is preventing discussion on topics?
That's like the dumbest question in the world, because one of them is so much fucking, it's so much more obvious, you know, that that the politically correct atmosphere is preventing honest discussion on controversial topics. Like, that is clearly the culprit in that, you know, given those two options.
I think he follows this by saying the answer is obvious. So yeah, but you know what I'm tempted to do here is to fall back on what I criticized other people for a moment ago and appeal to authority. So when he says, which is more likely, that all the great pre-World War II thinkers from all across the world were vicious racists, or blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I mean, the gall of the modern progressive type, lefty type, to rewrite history against the consensus opinion of all the great thinkers of history. It's like the fucking gall.
But that's a little bit different, though. That's a little bit different. You know, it's like if I'm arguing with my dad about what happened at a Led Zeppelin concert, you know, I didn't go to the Led Zeppelin concert.
Right.
He was at the Led Zeppelin concert.
Yeah.
So
it's a good point.
It's not that he's speaking from a position of authority, like a professor who is lecturing, and he's like, I just read a bunch of books. I didn't live in ancient Greece. I read a bunch of fucking books.
Yeah.
Whereas my dad was at the Led Zeppelin concert. So these great pre-World War II thinkers, you know, they were alive before World War II. And if you don't think that the world is a drastically different place after World War II, that World War II completely changed the face of culture all across the world, then you're stupid.
Yeah. And that's a good point. And I think it's linked to what he said at the very beginning about becoming skeptical of the conventional historical narrative and wanting to focus only on firsthand accounts and primary sources of history rather than relying on, you know, commentary or whatever. Because when you want to know what the world was like in the ancient times, reading Herodotus and reading Tacitus is far more informative than some asshole at Oxford trying to tell you in 2024 what it was like.
Trying to tell you that the Vikings were black.
Yeah.
Survive the Jive. Check that channel out.
All right. And this is where you're going to start to see some of the conspiracy theory, Graham Hancock stuff creep in. But I've seen it so much, I'm just going to read it. Go ahead.
You mentioned Graham Hancock, and I meant to say this earlier. I think it's funny that he said about Graham Hancock that something about Graham Hancock not understanding the depths of the subversion or something like that. And I'm sure that Graham Hancock heard that, his head would explode. He'd be like, oh, I don't understand. But I think that Asha Logos is right, actually. I think that even though he's like a smart person and he's a curious person and he's been turning over stones his whole life, I do think that he's a lib, you know. There are certain stones that he won't turn over.
Yeah.
He won't touch those fucking stones, you know? So
you know what's popping in my head right now? You remember our conversations about postmodernism?
Yeah.
About questioning all the assumptions and
the brutal critique of all that exists.
Yeah. And as much as I dislike postmodernism at a 50,000 foot level, they're very true, very, very accurate when they say that people, the amount of assumptions and things they take for granted that they consider so fundamental, they never even think to question it.
Lots of idea sets, postmodernism included, have good things about them, you know, things that you can and should take out. And if you don't, you're doing yourself a disservice. I completely think that about things like Marxism, Leninism. Read that shit, and if it works, take that.
Take what works. Yeah,
exactly. If it's effective, adopt it. Because we need every tool in the toolbox we can get.
True.
So
that's the lesson of mixed martial arts, you guys. All right. Here we go. He says, various organizations have been created to lock down important sites and control archaeological research. In America, the Smithsonian has a nasty habit of misplacing artifacts that don't cleanly fit the conventional model of history. And the youth are taught that it's practically heroic to tear down statues of white historical figures. In Sweden, the Minister for Culture, a lady named Alice Kuhnke, has ordered Viking artifacts to be melted down and recycled. From every angle, history is being destroyed and rewritten.
Yep.
What justification can Alice possibly have to melt down Viking artifacts and recycle them?
Racial hatred.
Is there not a better source of bronze than invaluable historical artifacts?
You would assume so.
For Christ's sake.
You would assume that we might be able to like mine some up, or there's like a park bench that we could melt down instead of a park bench from the 70s that we could melt down.
And this idea he brings up about tearing down statues of historical white figures in America, if you don't think that is a part of rewriting history, you're insane. When we were taught to be proud of the founding fathers, to be proud of being American, to be proud of the Constitution. George Washington is like a mythical character in American history, and all that serves a purpose, a uniting cultural purpose. And to think that young kids in college are ripping those statues down isn't completely topsy-turvying the unifying narrative of America. You're insane.
Yep. And from a, like an establishment regime perspective, think about Confederate statues. I understand the Confederacy is attached to some things that make you feel just kind of icky, you know?
Yeah.
But how much do you know about Robert E. Lee?
Precious little.
Yeah, you should look into Robert E. Lee. He's an interesting person, and like not what you would expect, not like some vicious racist, like kind of like an American aristocrat, like a nobleman. You know what I mean? And he's like the devil. He might as well have horns.
There's no room for nuance in propaganda. The effectiveness of propaganda breaks down if there's any niches. You can't have any nuance. It has to be black and white, and no pun intended, but there it is.
Yep.
Oh boy. Okay. All right. This is also really interesting. And I have to say, it's one of those things that I am guilty of. And this is what he says. Our understanding of history is now so poor that many believe the Germanic peoples just milled about the forest for millennia, that the Vikings were savages, and that the Italic, Germanic, and Celtic peoples are not only fundamentally separate and distinct from one another, but have little connection to the mounted Aryan element that roamed and subjugated large swaths of the Middle East, the steppe, and down into Greece, India, and East Asia. He says those were all actions of a single larger family. Now, you said earlier that I'm not a dumb person, and I'm not uncurious. I love ancient history. I fucking love it.
Yeah, but there's certain aspects that they won't give you. There's certain connections that they won't give you.
I never questioned. I'm not saying I believed it. I'm saying I never questioned otherwise that the Germanic tribes just milled about the forest for millennia. That's what I believe. That's what I fucking thought, right? That they just these civilizations emerge out of nowhere. And he's gonna say that in a bit. That's how I believed. And the fact that, like I said at the beginning of our conversation about how different a Gaelic human person from Wales is from a Mediterranean white person. They're both white people, but they're very, very different. There's almost nothing connecting them.
Yeah.
And this is what he's saying here. Most people believe the Italic, Germanic, and Celtic peoples were not only separate and distinct, but have no connection to one another.
Yeah, and he mentions the connection to the mounted Aryan element that roamed and subjugated large swaths of, all of basically that area. And I was taught in school and just like, my own reading of establishment narrative history that the Scythians were like Asian, like
Right.
some kind of, Asian admixture. And I think that was true like later in history that they did mix. But when you read the historical sources that are closer to the Scythians, they sound like white people to me.
Right. The Greeks thought of them like cousins of the Greeks. Yeah.
It's interesting, man.
It's very interesting. That book I was telling you about the land of the noble, something like religion in the land of the noble. I don't remember, something like that. I should have fucking found that book. That was the first place I learned about the religious connections, Dies Pater connected to Zeus and Jupiter and all that. When I was first introduced to that.
I heard about that listening to a podcast about the development of the English language.
Oh, interesting.
Interestingly enough.
Yeah.
That's how I heard about that.
And when I first was introduced to the idea of Proto-Indo-European as a group, and how they spread so far that the word Ireland and the word Iran both come from the word Aryan.
Yeah.
Isn't that crazy?
Yep. And it's crazy that, Iran was Persia for a long time. And from what I understand, the H-man, Mr. Mustache, he played a serious role in them becoming Iran.
I did. Yeah.
I don't know if that's true or not, but I bet it is.
Well, it was Mustache Man looking for the roots of the Aryan people. You remember he had like scientific expeditions that went to Nepal. The reason that they went to Iran is because there's a very distinct, one of the largest branches of the Indo-European people. They're called Indo-Iranian people now. That spread through India and Iran.
Yep. And again, how much do we know about what conclusions old Uncle Adolf drew from that information? Like none of that stuff is wrong. He's not wrong about any of that stuff. Like that. It's all historic. Like he's hunting out true history. So I don't know. I don't know what to make of that.
I also want to point out something, and you kind of hit on it a little earlier when you talk about the intermixing that happened when the Indo-European people spread throughout the world. They became different groups over time because of that, mixing cultures, mixing DNA, all that sort of thing. But I want to point out that if the Proto-Indo-European people spread to Ireland and to India and to Iran and even further east, we don't consider Indian people, Iranian people, and Irish people to be part of the same racial group today. And the point of this is that they are. And how can you be a white supremacist or whatever word you want to tag to it if what you're claiming is that you are part of a family that includes brown people, to put it really bluntly?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not 100% sure that I would take it that far, to be honest with you. Like the people who live in India and Iran now, Iran, I really don't know. Maybe it's like Arab admixture that's getting in there that, but I'm not sure that those people are. They clearly have some. I think even genetics will say that there's some of that Indo-European stock is still there, but I think there's a lot of like other things mixed in at this point. Whereas, you know, the European continent, I'm pretty sure that, you know, there's mixing going on there too. But again, I'm not trying to be. This is like, look into the genetics. Watch that Survive the Jive channel. The European people, the white European people, are genetically the most similar to, you know, what we know of as the original Indo-European people. Yeah, we maintain more of that genetic lineage than any of the other branches.
Yeah, and I also want to add, it's more complicated than when we say that Indo-European people are Europeans' ancestors. That's true. But we know that there are other white-skinned people that weren't Indo-European. As an example, the Basque people that live in Spain have a language and a genetic and heritage that is entirely different. Like, they're isolated in the mountains. It's entirely different from the rest of the Indo-European family.
Yeah.
And they're not the only group. There's another one that I just can't seem to think of at the moment, but the Basques are a good example of that. And they are mixed in with the
Finns. I think the Finnish people might be less related to the Indo-European.
You might be right. Yeah. You might be right about that.
Because Finnish is not an Indo-European language. That doesn't mean that their genetic stock isn't. Yeah. You know, like French people, they in language, but genetically they're basically Germanic. You know, they have been the entire time. The Franks were Germanic, and like the Lombards at the top of Italy, those are Germanic people. They're not Roman.
I think the Gauls were Celts.
Yeah, they were.
Yeah. All right. So this next section is really the final section leading up to the conclusion. And what I did is I broke this down into geographical sections. I'm going to call this section the evidence, the Indo-European peoples. Who are they? Okay. And this is where some of the stuff, I started with what I thought was the strongest. And again, who am I? I didn't deeply study this, but I started with what I think is the strongest historical evidence, and I kind of finish off with what I think is the weakest. So I'm going to start with a paraphrase rather than reading a direct quote from him, and it's something like this. The Indo-Europeans had a tradition of exploring, migrating, conquering, and settling, leaving telltale signs of their influence. So what are those telltale signs? Horses, a tradition of horse riding, the use of chariots, the symbol of the swastika or the sun wheel, the caste system for social organization, and similar religious pantheons. So this goes back to the Deus Pater, Sky Father, All Father in Norse, and Zeus and Jupiter, all and Tyre and Tu, and all these gods that are associated with this original Proto-Indo-European high god that connects the Celts, the Germanic tribes, to people as far away as ancient Persia and India, maybe even further east than that. So this is the idea. There is a tradition that's diversified in lots of ways in different directions over geography and time, but there's a unifying thing that goes back to them belonging to this Indo-European family. And these are the telltale signs. When you see these things, you can be pretty sure that there's some connection to the Indo-European people, and it gives evidence of European people belonging to this greater family, united by this historical context.
Yep.
All right, and he goes on. He says similar architecture such as pyramids and mound graves, and he shows pictures in the videos of different pyramid structures and mound structures.
That's one aspect of it that I don't get as much, because generally when I'm listening, I'm just listening. I'm like at work, and I'm not watching the actual video. So.
Yeah. I added some, like here, shows. I added some of the details of what was being shown. So I'll keep reading. He says, and we find the swastika everywhere, a symbol sacred to the Indo-Europeans. And this is where he shows examples of swastikas from all different parts of the world and different cultures. And he shows the earliest known example that we have evidence of. He says it belongs to the Samara culture and dates back to 4000 BC. So it is an ancient symbol. Right?
That's old.
He says it seems to be a hallmark of a relatively singular people and culture, with traces left on every continent as a testimony to their reach. Now, when he says every continent, He's including North and South America. And those are the things that I think are not that I'm saying I disbelieve them, but they're more of a stretch just because of the distance between them. And I saved that stuff for the end.
So the skepticism there is due to the fact that, the oceans in between them and things like that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, in this first episode, he referenced Thor Heyerdahl.
He sure does.
And it's pretty rock solid, man. Like if Thor Heyerdahl could do it with a balsa wood raft now, without anything that they wouldn't have had back then, humans are intrepid, man. Especially these fucking Indo-Europeans, man. They get out there.
People made it all the way to Easter Island in the middle of nowhere. They're capable of doing miraculous things. And I'm not saying that it's impossible. I'm just saying I saved that stuff to the end because there's a bigger challenge in getting there. That's it.
Yeah.
All right.
I don't know. Again, like I've said it a couple times, I don't know if he has all the details right, and maybe this is one of them, but I don't have that hard of a time believing that. And it basically just based on that Thor Heyerdahl thing.
Yeah, no, well, I understood. And we did an episode. I did an episode on Thor Heyerdahl. If you guys want to,
an interesting guy.
Yeah, very interesting. All right, and then the last thing I want to say before we get into the details is he says the ancient Persians, like the surrounding Thracians, Scythians, Sumerians, and others, whom would later migrate into Europe, were Aryan people of the Indo-European cultural and linguistic root. So this is just saying, look, the number of important historical tribal people in the world that trace their roots back to the original Indo-European people, they're all of those people. So there's evidence of us being a family with cultural and linguistic and genetic inheritance that we share. So most people believe that the Proto-Indo-Europeans came from the steppe of southern Russia, that somewhere in that neighborhood is where they were originated, and they moved to the rest of the world. So this section is just what he talked about specific to the Indo-European people making their way into the Near East. And again, we have so much evidence of the Indian and Iranian, the Avestan literature from Iran, the Zoroastrian religion, the Rig Veda, and the Vedic culture in ancient India. Those people and those languages are clearly Indo-European. Mm-hmm. And we know that they encountered other people, they call them Dravidian people, when they came into India that were already there. And they're different from the Indo-European people that mixed with them and so forth. So there's irrefutable historical, archaeological, and genetic evidence of this. So this is why I started here. And he says, the Aryan invaders swept into India in approximately 1500 to 1700 BC, establishing that hallmark Indo-European tradition called the caste system. Worshipped Indra as their highest god, whom historians long thought to be equivalent to the Norse Thor. The Rig Veda repeatedly refers to Indra's yellow hair and beard. Mm-hmm. So we're going back a long ways, and you're seeing in India reference to yellow hair and beards, right?
Yep. I think he also says something about Indra fighting like the swarthy adversary. Mm-hmm. So that's interesting.
Yeah. So
I mean, and not only is he referenced as blonde haired, yellow hair and beard, but also in juxtaposition, he's compared to somebody who is swarthy.
Yeah. So this is funny. Remember when I told you earlier that I was curious what you would think about what I chose to include and leave out? Mm. That was specifically something I left out.
Yeah. Because it may, because it's like, and
because it's doing more. It's doing more than saying there's evidence of these European people being there and coming into that part of the world. It's sort of like you say, a juxtaposition against smaller, more wild, darker haired people.
Yeah.
And people can read supremacy into that. And that's why I left it out.
Yeah.
Even though this is historical. I mean, we're not talking about.
I mean, you're reading of this is a quote from a very, very old text, there's nothing.
The oldest holy book in the world.
Yeah. Yeah, and the reason I bring it up is not to say, you know, the swarthy adversary is evil or anything like that. They were living in a place and they were fighting people who were coming to that place, and that's what people do. When people come to your place, you try to kill them.
Yeah,
you
well,
know,
that's yeah.
The reason I bring it up is because of the juxtaposition. You know, it's like they're not both the same.
There weren't yellow-haired bearded people there.
Yeah,
exactly. I get you. All right, then he says, King Darius of the Achaemenid ruling family in Persia goes out of his way to claim to be of the Aryan race. And so he reads this inscription from a place called Nakesh-e-Rastam, and it's just a carving somewhere, and it goes like this: I am Darius, the great king, king of kings, son of Hystapsis, an Achaemenid, a Persian, an Aryan, having Aryan lineage. So here you have examples of the yellow-haired bearded people coming into India, and you have historical reference to the ruling class of ancient Iran being proud and writing it down in stone for the world to know forever that he was an Aryan.
Yep. I remember when I first watched these videos, one of the things that I was like, one of the things that like made me uncomfortable in the first when I first started thinking about these things is like, basically it's like all of the people who have been in power and have been good ruler, even bad rulers too, but a lot of times these Indo-European people find themselves in a position where they're shaping history. You know, they're doing important things that are affecting the course of history. And it's just like, oh, all of our people are the ones who are important, you know?
Yeah.
But I mean, even if Darius was not, you know, if people are like, oh, he's not one of you, well, then why is he claiming to be, you know? And even if he actually isn't, why does he want to associate himself with those people? What is the reason for him? Like, he sees value in being in close proximity to these people.
He does. I think that something that's important has maybe been overlooked so far in the conversation is when we're talking about the tradition that the Aryan people brought to the places where they went, the caste system keeps coming up. And we know it really clearly in India because it still exists really clearly in India. But the idea is a form of social organization that divides people up into different tasks, right? So some people are leaders, some people are warriors, some people are farmers, some people are merchants, that kind of thing. And it was almost like you're born into that, right? So if your dad was the king, guess what? You're going to be one of the leaders. If your dad was a warrior, guess what? You better learn how to wield a sword. And that was an efficient way of organizing society. You know, maybe not the most efficient, but in ancient times, it was dramatically effective in allowing them to have superiority over other groups that didn't have that same type of social organization. And they were conquerors, right? If you come into a land and you conquer, who do you think you're going to make the ruling class? Somebody else? No. So the Aryans were the ruling class in that social organization. And so that explains part of what you were just talking about.
Yep.
The association, it's the association of the Aryans with the ruling class.
Did they talk or did he talk in this video about, I can't remember the word. It's like cryotos, something like that. And it's this Indo-European tradition of sending out.
Oh, he did. Yes.
Like the young people. It's like, all right, we're running out of space. You go out there and you get your own space, you know?
Yeah.
These roving war bands of young men that would just go out there and take, you know?
Yeah. The Viking Age of the Norse is a really good example of that.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what Vikings were. They were settlers. People think that they were rapists and pillagers and they were taking all their stuff and going back to Norway. No, they weren't. They were going places, conquering. I mean, they were, but they were also settling.
Yep.
You know?
I mean, look at the Danelaw. They affected the genetic. You know that the Vikings had a bigger influence on the genetic history of Britain than the Romans did. There's like almost no almost no trace of Roman genetics in England.
That's interesting. Yeah.
It's crazy that they could have been there for so long. It's like, that almost seems like an example of this like caste system. This, like, the Romans came up there and they conquered, and it's like you are you and we're us, and we don't breed with you.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
you know, I'm sure there's some of it, but obviously very little. Dude, looking at the genetics,
that's interesting.
Very little.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Okay, so that's the Near East. Now we're gonna go to North Africa. This is interesting. This is fucking interesting. He says, we have evidence of tobacco and cocaine, right? Materials that wouldn't have been available without long-distance trade networks, and blonde-haired mummies of the pharaohs discovered in recent decades. So when he says we have evidence of tobacco and cocaine, he's talking about from mummies.
Yeah.
And I wasn't sure about this, so I looked it up. Turns out the greatest pharaoh of history, Ramses II, he's the one who we call Ramses the Great.
Mm-hmm.
His mummy has red hair.
You didn't know that?
Fucking no. And they said that not only that he's likely from a family of redheads because it's a genetic, you pass it on, right? So the pharaohs from his line would have been red-haired pharaohs. It's not like it was one guy. The ruling class of ancient Egypt at their height were red-haired people.
Interesting, huh?
And then he says, he doesn't say this, but this is something I looked up, that red hair was perceived in ancient Egypt to be a godly trait. So people with red hair were both feared and respected.
That's true of red hair in like the British Isles too. It's like it's tied to divinity. It's like they're closer to God than the people who don't have red hair.
That's very interesting. So that's it for North Africa. But the idea that these common architectural styles like pyramids were connected, or in Asha Logos anyway, connecting them to the Indo-European people. I think historically, I don't know how the argument is made, but to point this,
you know, this is much later. I mean, we're talking about Egypt at this point, so this is way later. This is the 1200s.
Yeah.
They said that Genghis Khan and his progeny had red hair and green eyes.
Oh, we're going to get there.
Oh, yeah. Okay,
yeah, nice. We got some of that in here.
All right.
Which surprised the shit out of me.
You had to have known that because you listened to Hardcore History, The Wrath of the Kites.
That detail didn't stick.
Yeah.
All right. And then he makes one reference to the British Isles. And I just want to say that before we get into this, that the Greeks, at least the Mycenaean Greeks, the Minoans are perhaps a different story, but the Mycenaean Greeks were Indo-European people, and they swept down into Greece. They're the ones that destroyed the Minoan civilization. They were Indo-European people, and I say that because we're getting ready to talk about Troy. So he references a guy named Geoffrey of Monmouth. That may ring a bell for some people because some of the King Arthur legends, the oldest King Arthur legends, come from this historian Geoffrey of Monmouth.
Yep.
He was a Catholic cleric who lived in Wales from 1095 to 1155 AD, and he wrote a famous history called The History of the Kings of Britain. So this is where you see some of the stories about King Arthur. But in the histories of the Kings of Britain, he claimed that Brutus was the grandson of Aeneas, who left Troy after the Trojan War and traveled to Britain, and he was the founder of London.
Yep. So Aeneas left Troy and went to Italy, and then Brutus left there and went and founded there.
Yeah.
I remember what the original name for it was, but there was like a specific name. Yeah.
So that's the British Isles.
And
go ahead.
Again, like a lot of establishment history people would scoff at that. If you tried to entertain that as being a literal history, as something that really happened, they would laugh at you.
Yeah.
But it's like, why? You're thousands and thousands of years removed.
If you just go to the wiki for Geoffrey Monmouth and you read about the history of the Kings of Britain, it says exactly that. It's questionable veracity. The history is of questionable veracity. But you're right. Geoffrey Monmouth was fucking alive in the 1100 AD.
And like, what are the people who's saying that it's of questionable veracity? What are they basing that on?
It's a good question. I wish I knew.
I did too. They don't seem to be that like open with that stuff, you know?
No.
It's like the only thing they've got for you, if you question it, is you're silly. Don't be silly.
It's the appeal to authority.
You're either a big silly boy or you're a racist.
A racist, yeah.
You know? Those are the options.
All right, now we're going to get into East Asia, and some of this stuff here I thought was maybe questionable, but I don't have anything to base that on. I just never heard it before, so took me aback. So so we're going to talk about the Indo-Europeans in East Asia. He says the Asaberg Buddha found in Sweden was placed in a Viking burial around 830 AD. And he shows a picture of this thing. And it is clearly a Buddha form sitting in the lotus position with 4 embossed swastikas on his chest. He says it wasn't imported, but created locally. And then he asks the question, might Buddhism and Buddha himself be traced to Indo-European peoples? I never heard that before. And then he says this. He shows a statue of what he calls the large Buddha, but I looked it up and it's called the Buddha of Bamiyan. It's a 6th century AD statue. There was actually 2 of them from Afghanistan. These were one of the statues, if you remember the Taliban blowing them up, it's one of those statues that no longer exists.
Fuckers.
It's 175 feet tall, and they show a video from the 70s, a clip of a video of these people seeing it. At the time, it was already defaced, like the face of the Buddha was gone. But there were surviving paintings that were around the enclosure above his head, 175 feet up in the air.
I have a memory of that from having watched it, is that like the guy who's talking about it, he's like, they're defaced, but you can see what they look like. You know, it's like you can't see maybe the faces, but you can see he's got red hair, he's got a red beard.
Well, that's the thing. These paintings that were up above the guy's head painted in the enclosure, they represent men with red hair and beards. And the statue is completely gone. You can't verify that, but in this video, you can see the paintings were of men with fair skin, red hair, and beards.
Yeah.
Then he shows, he says, the face of Buddha as bearded with European facial features and hairstyle. And he's shown opposite Indra. And we remember Indra's connection with the Indo-European being the high god of the Indo-Europeans. And this is where, to me, it got super interesting. And I don't know, like, I wish I knew more about it. He says, the Buddha was from the Shakya clan, also called Sakya or Sakai, which scholars tie to the linguistic root from which Scythian and ultimately Saxon is derived.
And you can see it, you know, like it's with the Indo-European words, like modern English and modern German, like you can see how they're related. Like, you know, this building that you live in, what's it called?
House.
In German, you know what it's called?
Hus.
House.
Oh, is it house?
Yeah, it's just spelled H-A-U-S.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
But it's called house.
Yeah.
What you wear on your feet?
Shoes.
Shua is plural. You know, they do plurals differently than we do. But it's like, so the fact that they look like similar words. They have the same kind of like consonant vowel structures and things like that.
Sakai, Saxon, Shakya, Scythian. Yeah, it's interesting. So is it possible that the Proto-Indo-European people that made it that far into India, which we know they were there, where the Buddha was born, Gautama Buddha, was he part of a clan that was from an Indo-European migration? That is perfectly possible, and I never considered it.
Yeah. I mean, it's so deeply associated with the people who are there now, you know, that they're like, why would you even think that?
Exactly.
But that's what this guy's saying. You can look into it and you can see that he's not lying. Maybe there's some kind of like confusion. Maybe there's some kind of a missing puzzle piece that we don't have. But without that puzzle piece and without that confusion being cleared up, it seems like this would be like a worthwhile thing to mention in, you know, the study of history.
Absolutely. And I would love to hear the argument against it, but
you're not willing to make that argument.
No. All right. Then he says something interesting here. He says, even before the time of Buddha, an Indo-European people we now call the Tocharians had pushed all the way to China, leaving mummified remains in the Tarim Basin. We talked about the Tarim mummies before. He says these mummies
on our episode with Josh, right?
Yeah, probably. Yeah. Sounds like a topic we talk about with Josh. He says these mummies were found with tartan print clothing similar to the type found in Scotland. I want to add, these mummies were dated to 2000 BC. They have red and blonde hair, and they're wearing tartan plaid in China.
It's a long way away from Scotland. I don't think Ross has hiked that far.
I don't think Ross has hiked that far. And then he says, a specialist in ancient DNA, a guy named Victor Mayer, he stated this. He has a Victor Mayer quote. It says, "The new finds force a re-examination of old Chinese books which describe legendary figures of great height with deep-set blue or green eyes, long noses, full beards, and red or blonde hair." So they clearly were there as far east as China. I think these mummies were found in the Gobi Desert or something like that. So, and then this is where he gets to the Genghis Khan stuff. He says, Genghis Khan and his successor sons were spoken of as having red hair and blue or gray eyes. According to the Persian Abu Ghazi, the tribal clan to which Temujin belonged were known as the gray-eyed men. And I looked that up. The clan he belonged to is called the can you pronounce that? Borjigin clan, and it literally means gray-eyed or blue-eyed men.
Interesting. You know, when I found this out, it actually kind of, I mean, I still like Dan Carlin's podcast. It's a very interesting podcast, but like he mentioned that they had, you know, are talked about as having red hair and blue or green eyes or gray.
Yep.
And I get why Dan Carlin is not like going down that path, because it's a good way to have people cancel you and all that stuff.
It's a can of worms.
But it seems, I don't know, man. It's like, I feel like it's a little intellectually dishonest of him, and you know, it's like kind of cowardly, you know?
Well, the question is, why in the world would people from Mongolia, which by the way is connected to the Russian steppe by nothing but steppe, right? The Russian steppe goes all the way to Mongolia, the huge grasslands with horse riding people, and the Mongols were known for their horse riding, just like the Indo-European. How could these people who are today very Asian, they look very Chinese, you know, they had that type. How could somebody from that, by the way, from the ruling class of these tribes in Mongolia have red hair and blue or gray eyes? How could that be possible? It could be a strange mutation that just happened, or it could be influenced from another genetic stock.
Yep. I mean, so again, we're talking about like Genghis Khan. I think you're talking early 1200s, you know, like 12 teens, somewhere in that, when he really gets. So that's late. I mean, you know, we're in year 2024, right. So that's a long time ago. But in comparison to the stuff we've been talking about, that's not that long ago.
Right.
And it's crazy to think that genetic admixture could have still been very prominent that far, you know, that far into the present.
Yeah. And
why that has been completely smashed, you know, that nobody talks about that, you know? Why can't we know that Genghis Khan maybe had red hair? What is the what's the hand? Because it's not like these what are the names of the mummies? What are they called?
The Tarim mummies.
Yeah. It's not like, I understand that not a lot of people know what those mummies are. Most people never even heard of that. But you ask people who Genghis Khan is, most people have an idea of who that is.
Right.
Do they have any idea that he is listed as having red hair?
I didn't.
No.
Yeah. That's amazing.
Why is that? Why
would that be something you would want to obscure? It seems like one of those unique historical facts that would be interesting because it's so hard to explain. It's so unusual. It would be something that, you know, you would want to, you would remember, and yet it's obscured.
Forced to not remember it.
Just like Ramses having red hair, obscured.
Mm-hmm.
I just figured Ramses was and I don't know. I don't know if the ancient Egyptians were considered Arab, but you know, something like that. That's what I would have assumed. Some mixture of maybe Nubian and Arab people.
Yep. It makes sense. You know, because of what you know now in the present, it's like the same thing with Buddha. You know, like, why would you assume that he may have been Indo-European when he's, you know, that area is all Asian. All of the people who worship him are, you know, whatever.
Right.
All the people who follow that tradition are Asian, unless they're like gay people from California, you know, who are like pretending to be Buddhist.
Right.
You know,
But even that's the thing, is even today.
I don't know why I'm picking on California.
Even
there's gay people here.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, even today, the people in India, especially northern India, are Indo-European people. You know, that we call them Asian, but they are Indo-European people, just like you, just like me.
Yep.
Right.
Are we still in?
No, that was it for Asia.
They mentioned another thing was the Daimo class in Japan.
Another one that I specifically left out. So
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, it's just that. Well, I'm assuming you left it out because they are like a higher class.
Exactly.
But that's just the facts.
It goes back to what we said before about the caste system and the ruling class being the victors in the conquest. And so the idea here is that there is a division in Japanese culture that I am completely unfamiliar with, where some people are they look different than the other class, and they're considered to be higher status people.
Yep.
I don't know any of the details, but if you look at them,
they're taller, they have thick beards, they have
more angular noses.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So there's a suggestion that they may have been part of an Indo-European group that came as far east as Japan.
And that they potentially inspired Bushido culture,
Yeah.
which is like kind of similar to a lot of like the chivalric knightly tradition and things like that.
Yeah. And they didn't say anything about this, but the other thing to mention when we're talking about Japan is the Ainu. The Ainu people that live in the northern islands. They used to live all over Japan. Now they live on reservations like Native Americans do in the United States, and they have big white beards. You know, I'm just picturing the old men, big white beards. But they have big beards, which is very unusual for Asian stock people. And there's suggestion that they were the original from Russia. What's today Russia?
Yeah, I mean, it's close, you know. So if Thor Heyerdahl could get from where he went from to the United, it was the United States at that point. Going from Russia to Japan doesn't seem like shit.
It would be cake. Yeah.
So
that brings me to the most speculative stuff. Go ahead.
So with the Daimo thing and you not wanting to put that in there, you realize that you're like doing it for them.
Yeah.
You're like upholding the lie.
I wanted to make this argument. I wanted to make Asha Logos' argument in the least controversial way possible. That's what I wanted to do.
Gotcha.
That's what I wanted to try to do.
And here I just come in like a bull in a china shop.
I'll touch on it at the very end. I want to try to get through the rest of this a little bit quickly, but this is the most controversial, but also the most Graham Hancockian of all of the material that we're going to cover.
Hancockian.
This is the section I'm going to call Into the Americas and Beyond.
All right.
And beyond. All right, he says this. Numerous statues, especially in South America, of bearded and fair-skinned men coming across the water to bestow knowledge and cultural gifts. So these appear in South America.
Which is not controversial.
Not controversial.
That's well known.
Yeah. He says, according to Peruvian tradition, a nation with a white king called Contiki, or Contiki Viracocha, ruled the land before the Inca. His head is hewn in prehistoric stone statues high up in the Andes. This is, again, to Kyle's point, known history, nothing controversial about it. He's also connected to the Aztec god Quetzalcoatl. I don't know how you say Quetzalcoatl. Right. He was also supposed to be a bearded white god, creator god. And I want you to keep in mind that the word that they call him in the Peruvian language or whatever, Contiki Viracocha, because he says in the Polynesian islands, people speak of the great Tiki who brought their ancestors to the islands. So now we're getting all the way out there. And he says, in North America, there were countless stories of colonists unearthing bodies of Caucasoid skull shape, many extremely tall, and several having natural red hair remaining intact. Despite hundreds of pictures and newspaper articles, little evidence exists today, as they were entrusted to and misplaced by the Smithsonian. Now, I told you I've been watching this YouTube show called The Y-Files, and the guy talks all about cool shit, all about ancient mysteries. And I cannot tell you how many times in that episode some archaeological piece gets talked about, disappears, and it's because it was sent to the Smithsonian. Another show I like to watch was a History Channel show called America Unearthed, and it's all about interesting shit about history in the United States and in South America and Central America and Canada, for that matter, that is little known or controversial. And again, lots of those pieces of evidence lead to the Smithsonian, where they disappear, which I just think is interesting.
Yeah, that's I never watched that show, but when I watched this at first, you know, especially some of the stuff that he's talking about like 8-foot tall skeletons that got sent to the Smithsonian that they misplaced. And I'm like, oh, I don't know about that. That sounds a little crazy. So you look into it and you're like, oh no, it's like they apparently do have a reputation for losing things.
Isn't that interesting? And you know what I learned, dude? There was this law that was passed a while back, and it said it was like a Native American artifact, what's the word? Where basically the government decided, if we have Indian artifacts on display somewhere in museums and the Native people want those artifacts back, we have to give them back. So they passed this law, and I read, and then you read the law, and it says any museum who holds Native artifacts, with the exception of the Smithsonian, has to return them to the Native people if requested.
That's crazy.
Isn't that crazy? All right, so my I'm getting
it just makes me wonder how much history is destroyed. You know, like stuff that we're on this trail. How much stuff will we never be able to know because it's been destroyed?
It's like the Library of Alexandria level catastrophe.
Yeah, I mean, it makes you wonder about the Library of Alexandria. Was that, how did that happen?
I don't know.
No, I don't know if anyone knows. I don't know.
Yeah,
but it makes you wonder.
I'm getting dinged in my pocket that dinner's ready. But I want to just run through this last little bit. All right, he says, in South America, we have the cloud people of the Chachapoya culture, as well as the Paracas skull finds, both of which show fair hair of thinner type than the Native Americans, and on an obvious Caucasoid skull shape. Genetic testing has also linked them to haplogroups found in Europe today. He says the Chachapoyas were buried in sarcophagi, sculpted with obvious European features, which bear an intriguing resemblance to those of another location with legends of fair-skinned people in ancient times, Easter Island. So from start to finish, we have at least reasonable evidence worth exploring that suggests not only are the Indo-European people of one lineage, but that they conquered and traveled the entire world as far as North and South America and the Polynesian Islands.
It's quite a bit of reach.
So I wanted to say, these are the last 4 thoughts that I wanted to say, that when you look at this, the intention of this video, this channel, this message that Asha Logos is bringing to us, there is no suggestion of superiority or supremacy apart from the context of when conquest puts Indo-European groups in the role of a ruling class. And I just said that's equally true of any conquering people. There's no indication that he's saying Indo-European people are superior. All right. He also points to evidence of intergroup cooperation, trade networks, cultural connections across time, and interbreeding with indigenous populations that create new distinct cultures and societies. The difference between one Aryan people and another are those cultures that they interacted with when they got there. He also speaks of cultural decline, but not driven by intermixing, right? He talks about it explicitly, attributing it to the weakening of cultural systems that unify the people, and those are the caste system and the religion that unifies people. Those specific attributes of the Indo-European group, when they break down, then the cultures break down. And then lastly, he criticizes consumerism a bunch, which I thought was interesting. The reason for the downfall. material things.
Yeah.
And I was kind of taken aback by that, because it seems to me like markets and not consumerism, but markets are something that you might say are an Indo-European invention. Maybe they are, maybe they're not, but they're one of those things that were good, even if they were something introduced to the Indo-European people that they used for themselves. I don't think that it's a bad thing in and of itself, but he's really critical of consumerism in that way.
Well, do you not see a difference between consumerism and markets?
I do, but I wasn't sure he did.
Yeah,
I wasn't sure he was making that distinction.
I don't know. I guess I'm just like, because I see the rest of the quality of the argument, I guess I'm just giving him the benefit of the doubt, you know? And it's like, to me, it just seems like the difference between consumerism and general markets is like so obvious that, like, how could he not see a difference between them?
Yeah.
And I would say that markets are good and consumerism is bad, you know?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I just like, I guess I'm just comfortable extending the benefit of the doubt on that one.
Yeah. All right. So we're clearly getting rushed off this episode now. So any final thoughts?
No, I'm happy to talk about the rest of them though.
All right. So I'm thinking that it might be interesting to reach out to Asha Logos. Maybe we can expose him to this conversation and see what he thinks.
Cool.
I think it would be cool. So we'll give that a try maybe. And then as I go through the rest of the episodes, I think there's like 5 others, or maybe there's 10.
There's a bunch of them.
Yeah. And we can do more of this as we go along.
Oh yeah, man.
All right, buddy. Thank you.
Season 4, episode 1.
Yep.
In the books.
Well, there you have it. That's one avenue explored, but infinitely more still to go.